13 through chapter 4, verse 3. Two kinds of wisdom. Who was wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but it's earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, you will find disorder and evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire but do not have, so you kill. You covet but cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with the wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. And then from Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him. They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you quarreling about on the road?" But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and servant of all." He took a little child whom he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me."
Thank you for reading for us this morning, Suzanne. And welcome, church. It's great to be together again. It's great to see you. So glad you decided to join us this morning. We're in the 25th week of Ordinary Time. That's why we have the green tapestry on the cross and the table. Ordinary Time is not Advent. Advent is a time of anticipation. Easter is a time of celebrating. Ordinary Time is actually most of the year. It's ordinary. There's no special events that happen in the church calendar, but it's a very important time. It's a time of developing discipline and growing in wisdom. And a question I'd like to ask you this morning is, would you pass the wisdom test? Like many of you, I have a vegetable garden at home, and during the growing season, I was patiently waiting for my tomatoes to ripen. And now at harvest, we have so many tomatoes that we hardly know what to do with them. Someone once said that intelligence is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. Keep that in mind. Would you pass the wisdom test? I'm sure most of you would if that was the only question on the test. The reading in James today shows us that there are two kinds of wisdom. There's the real thing that's not just about accumulated knowledge, but it translates into actions, the way we relate to others, deeds done in humility. And then there's the kind of wisdom that's characterized by bitter envy, selfish ambition, always seeking things primarily to benefit yourself. And James says that such wisdom does not come from heaven, but it's earthly, it's unspiritual, demonic. In other words, it comes from the father of lies. And note how the NIV version uses quotes around the word wisdom in this verse. The quotes are telling us that this is not real wisdom. This is pretend wisdom, pseudo-wisdom, if you will, a substitution for the real thing. And then he goes on to describe with a number of words how real wisdom is expressed. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is, first of all, pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Would you pass the wisdom test? I think it's interesting that the lectionary pairs this reading with the reading from Mark that Suzanne just read. In James, we get a verbal description of these two kinds of wisdom. In the gospel reading from Mark, Jesus gives us a live demonstration. We get a front row seat, in a wisdom tutorial, if you will. Now, we're 3 weeks into the school semester, so if you're a student, you may already have had a pop quiz. And this is actually the third time since the middle of August that we've addressed the subject of wisdom. And maybe it's time we took a wisdom test. So I'd like to look at 4 differences this morning between pseudo-wisdom and godly wisdom illustrated in Mark chapter 9, and maybe have you score yourself on a scale of 1 to 9 on these different items. So the real-life situation is this. Jesus is with his disciples teaching them, and he said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and 3 days later, he will rise again." Now, the NIV gives this passage the subheading, Jesus predicts his death for a second time. The first time is actually in the chapter just before this, where Jesus says essentially the same things to his disciples. But this isn't really a prediction in the sense that you're guessing what might happen in the future. This is actually a telling of the facts. Jesus is telling us what's going to happen in the future. What Jesus is saying seems pretty straightforward to us, but the disciples didn't understand. They didn't understand what he meant. And I wonder, how is it possible that given that this is the second time he has spoken very directly about it, how is it that they don't understand this? Well, maybe they thought he was speaking in code. Maybe he was using metaphors to convey a deeper meaning that they'd have to search for. Jesus was known for this. In the chapter just before this, Jesus warned them to watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees. They thought it was because they didn't have bread with them, but Jesus wasn't talking about bread. He was talking about something different. Maybe the fact that Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man threw them off. Was he talking about himself, or was he talking about somebody else? Now, Daniel, back in the Old Testament, refers to the Son of Man, but he saw the Son of Man coming in clouds of glory. The Son of Man was actually a picture of triumph. To come and be killed by mere mortals, this made no sense at all to associate with the Son of Man. And perhaps this was at the source of their misunderstanding. The Messiah was supposed to conquer, not to be conquered, to end suffering, not to endure suffering. The first time that Jesus spoke plainly to his disciples about being put to death was right after Peter confessed that Jesus was in fact the Messiah. And Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. He couldn't accept that the way to victory was through suffering. And the second time around, the disciples still could not accept this difficult truth. Pseudo-wisdom rejects suffering. We continue to struggle with this, don't we? What good can possibly come from suffering? Why should I put my financial security in jeopardy for someone who hasn't worked as hard as I have? Why should I give to a charity when I have my own future to worry about? I'll never get ahead if I use my spare time to help somebody else. Godly wisdom is not afraid to suffer for the sake of others. Jesus knew what was going to happen to him when he got to Jerusalem. And rather than avoid his sham trial and the crucifixion, he walked toward it. The writer of Hebrews says that Jesus learned obedience from what he suffered. Now, there's a theological hot potato. And we won't try to unpack all of that this morning. I'll just kind of leave that with you as a quiet bomb. But Jesus knew that suffering wasn't the final word. His suffering brought about victory over death, not only for himself, but for everyone who trusts in him. This was greatness at its best. But Jesus wasn't just setting us free to do as we pleased. Jesus was modeling for us the way to greatness. It's countercultural. The way up is down. The way to be great is to sacrifice yourself for others. And this will look different for each one of us. Maybe it'll mean using some of your study time to help someone else who's struggling to prepare for an exam. Maybe it'll mean using some of your savings to help someone else put a down payment on their house. Maybe it'll mean giving up some of your leisure time to babysit your neighbor's kids or drive someone around to their medical appointments. Some of you have a long habit of doing these very kinds of things. So where do you score yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 on this first item? One being total rejection of suffering, 10 being not the least bit hesitant to suffer for the sake of others. A second difference between pseudo-wisdom and godly wisdom is simply this. Pseudo-wisdom is too proud to ask. When Jesus told the disciples that the Son of Man is going to suffer and be delivered into the hands of men, they will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise, they didn't understand what he meant, and they were afraid to ask him about it. Now, do you wonder why they were afraid to ask? Can anyone think of a reason why they might have been afraid to ask? Any takers? Why might they have been afraid to ask Jesus what he meant by this? They don't want to get rebuked. Good answer. Yep. Jesus could be quite cutting with his remarks sometimes. When Peter rebuked Jesus the first time Jesus talked about his death, Jesus actually spoke sternly to him and he said, "Get behind me, Satan." That must have stung. Was Jesus on edge during this time when he was looking ahead to the suffering that he would have to endure? When the disciples didn't understand what Jesus was talking about when he spoke of the yeast of the Pharisees in the previous chapter, Jesus' response to them is this: "Do you still not understand? Are your hearts so hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear?" And earlier in chapter 9, this chapter that we're in today, when the disciples fail to drive out an evil spirit, Jesus says to them, "You unbelieving generation, how long will I stay with you? How long will I put up with you?" Have the disciples decided it's best not to poke the bear? I suspect that given their previous failures of understanding and performing, they don't want to look like fools again. Maybe if we just keep quiet and nod our heads, we'll seem like intelligent people. We might be clueless, but at least we won't look stupid. After all, we're the chosen disciples of the greatest rabbi that ever lived. Afraid to ask because it will make us look weak. Or maybe afraid to ask because it sounds like a stupid question. This is often the reason I was afraid to ask questions in school. I thought everyone knows the answer to this question but me, and if I ask, they'll realize what a dummy I am. God is not afraid of our questions. Jesus says to us today through the passage we read in James, "You do not have because you do not ask God." God welcomes our questions. So do I want to look smart, or do I actually want to be smart? We won't get any smarter if we don't follow our curiosity and ask questions. Now, the church hasn't always been a safe place to ask questions. Only a few hundred years ago, people at church would look at you strangely if you wondered out loud if the world was actually round and not flat. We need to be full of grace toward one another when it comes to asking questions. And I hope this can be a safe place, where there are no stupid questions. Maybe somebody here is honestly wondering, what does the death of Jesus have to do with me? Not a stupid question. Maybe somebody is wondering, if I'm attracted to somebody of the same gender, is there still a place for me here? Not a stupid question, and not a foregone conclusion. One of the reasons that I'm excited about the Alpha program that we're running in mid-October is that it offers a safe place to ask questions about the Christian faith. There's no assumption that you should already know the answers, and there are no stupid questions. We all come to this as beginners. So again, if you have friends or neighbors who have questions about the meaning of life or the relevance of Jesus, bring those friends along with you to the Alpha program that we're running. Pseudo-wisdom is too proud to ask, godly wisdom is not afraid to ask. So where do you score yourself on this item? Thirdly, pseudo-wisdom hides a fault. James tells us, if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. It goes on to say, you covet, but you can't get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. And now look what the disciples are doing in today's passage in Mark. They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, what were you arguing about on the road? But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. This is almost comical because right up against a passage where Mark gives us a picture of the greatness that involves suffering and downward mobility, we have the disciples arguing about who is better than who. And they must have realized how wrong-headed this was, because when Jesus asks them what they're arguing about, they fall silent. Let's pretend this conversation never happened. There's nothing here, Jesus. But Jesus isn't asking because he doesn't know what they're talking about. He's asking them because he knows precisely what they're talking about. And he wants to bring the matter into the light where it can be corrected. I wonder what started this argument in the first place. Were Peter, James, and John bragging about the fact that Jesus had taken them up on the mountain where he was transfigured just a few verses earlier, left the rest of the disciples behind? Was James or John maybe criticizing the rest of the disciples because they failed to cast a demon out of a man's son while they were up in the mountain? And were those other disciples pushing back? Well, Jesus couldn't trust you to be left alone for a minute, so he took you with him up on the mountain, jostling back and forth over who was better. James and John are still in this game in the next chapter when they come to Jesus and ask if they can sit on his right hand and his left when Jesus takes the throne. The rest of the disciples are indignant about this. And here in chapter 9, the disciples don't want to admit that they're having this argument. That's what pseudo-wisdom does. When called out for a fault, it denies, it covers up, it tries to pretend it never happened. We think that if we ignore the problem, it'll evaporate. But instead it rots and begins to contaminate everything and everyone around it. We've certainly seen this in the arena of politics, but we've also seen it in several prominent churches within the last decade. One in particular fairly close to home, where a male pastor in a compromising relationship with a female church member kept it secret, and when eventually found out, denied that there was anything seriously wrong. And the ripple effects of that situation have been staggering. And perhaps if those who are closer to the situation had not been afraid to ask questions, had not been afraid to call out questionable habits, the infidelity could have been headed off and the damage contained. Godly wisdom is not afraid to expose a fault. This wisdom is relevant not just for issues that rock institutions and churches and governments. It's relevant for our own marriages and friendships as well. But we need to be very careful how we go about exposing a fault. It must always be with grace and humility, never with an I'm better than you attitude, because all of us have things that we have swept under the rug, don't we? There are two little words in verse 35 of chapter 9 of Mark that I think speak to the manner in which Jesus confronts the misguided thinking of the disciples. Sitting down. Sitting down. Sitting down to me is not a power posture. It's more of a reasoning posture. If he was really going to give it to them, I would picture him standing up and pointing his finger. But he's sitting down, and not only that, he takes a little child into his arms. And he's speaking to them with this little child in his arms. And it's hard to imagine that Jesus would be yelling or even scolding while holding this young child in his arms. So back to the quiz. If 1 is always hides a fault, and 10 is never afraid to expose a fault, how would you score yourself on this item? There's one more. Worldly wisdom holds on to privilege. Godly wisdom is not afraid to let go of privilege. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all." Apparently, the disciples thought they were something special because they were, after all, chosen to be disciples of the Messiah. Surely that must give them certain privileges that other people didn't have. That's why James and John were so bold to ask whether they could sit on Jesus' left hand and his right hand. In verse 38, John says, "Jesus, we saw someone driving out a demon in your name, and we told him to stop because he was not one of us." Privilege. Only we should be allowed to do stuff like that because we're in Jesus' inner circle. We've got the backstage pass. If everyone starts driving out demons in Jesus' name, what's so special about us? And Jesus takes this little child into his arms and says, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not only me, but the one who sent me." In other words, what gives you access to God's own self is not that you're standing proudly beside the greatest rabbi or miracle worker who ever lived. It's serving the least of these in my name. That's what gives you access to God. Children were at the bottom of the social hierarchy. There was nothing gained by serving children. Most people would think that this was beneath their dignity. It would make them look like fools. Fortunately, the value of children has come up a little bit since then. Jesus isn't looking just for fans who will praise him and admire him. He's looking for followers, people who will join him in doing what he does, serving people not because it will make them look good, but because no one else will. A couple of years ago, when I was working at Royal City Mission, I was on the evening shift, and I was out picking garbage up along the side of the church. Now, this was a perpetual job. There was always bottles and cups and drug paraphernalia, wrappers, discarded meals, sometimes human feces along that walkway. The church board was meeting in a room downstairs that night, and as I walked by the window picking up garbage, one of the board members said to the senior pastor, "Why is our director of operations out picking up garbage?" And the senior pastor replied to him, well, that's just the way it is around here. None of us are too good to pick up garbage or to unplug toilets, which we did also on a daily basis. Unless you think I get a perfect score on this test item, I should also tell you that yesterday I was listening to Quirks and Quarks on CBC Radio while I was having my lunch. Did anyone else hear that episode yesterday? I'm the only one that listens to CBC, I guess. Anyway, Bob McDonald was interviewing Roberta Bondar, first Canadian female astronaut and neurologist. And I thought, wouldn't people like to know that I shared the stage with Roberta Bondar? We were both granted degrees from the University of Toronto on the same night. I sat right next to her. That must make me pretty special. The reality is, I'm quite sure she doesn't have a clue who I am. That was vanity within me. Me seeking privilege through my very, very loose connection with a famous person. Jesus laid aside all of his rights and privileges as the creator of the universe, becoming a creature himself, and subjected himself to every form of human indignity. He wasn't motivated by a desire for prestige as the world's greatest record holder for servanthood. He was motivated by his love for the least. And he calls for us to follow in his footsteps. So it's time to score yourself on this last test item. Give yourself a 1 if you cling to privilege at every opportunity. Give yourself a 10 if you've never been afraid of letting go of privilege of any kind, be it the color of your skin, your position in the company, your birth order in the family, or something else. And now it's time to add up your scores. I didn't give you pencil and paper. I'm trusting you that you've got a good memory for this. A good score, a perfect score would be 40, 10 out of 10 on all 4 items. A rock bottom score would be 4. Now, if you scored 10 or below, you've got problems. Perhaps you should see one of our elders or pastors for some after-school help. If you scored 35 or above, you've got problems too. You're probably lying. You're probably not being completely truthful with yourself. Our human condition is that we're steeped in pseudo-wisdom. We're driven by vanity and selfish ambition. That's the world that we live in. James says that godly wisdom, the wisdom that we have been talking about today, comes from heaven. It's from beyond ourselves. It's not what comes naturally to us. It's pure, it's peace-loving, it's considerate, it's submissive, it's full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. The good news is that godly wisdom is available to us. James implores us today to ask God for what we do not have. He says that God jealously longs for the Spirit he has caused to live within us. He longs for that Spirit to sing the same tune that his Spirit sings. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. The humble are not afraid to ask. And we've covered a lot of ground in these few minutes. We don't move from pseudo-wisdom to godly wisdom overnight. And perhaps this morning you'd like to take that one area where you scored the lowest and ask God to teach you how to grow in that particular area. But when you ask, you need to be prepared you need to be ready to learn. And I'd love to hear what happens. Let me pray with me. Thank you, Father, that you make godly wisdom available to us. Forgive us for swimming in the sea of pseudo-wisdom. Thank you for bringing it to our attention this morning. Give us the courage to acknowledge one of those areas where we really need to grow. And Lord, will you come along beside us and teach us to become more like you? And we ask for this in Jesus' name.